Welcome to The Spiritual Life. I'm Father Jim Martin. On this podcast, we reflect on how people experience God in their prayer and their daily lives. And I'm joined by my producer, Maggie Van Dorn. Maggie, good to be with you.
Good to be with you, Jim.
How are you?
I am doing well. And I'm so excited for this conversation that we're having on this episode with Sister Joyce Rupp, a longtime friend of yours. She calls us from Des Moines, Iowa, and Joyce is a pretty renowned Catholic author, spiritual director. She's a retreat leader, and she is a member of the Servite Order, which is the Servants of Mary. Joyce has written numerous books on spirituality and prayer, and the two that we are focusing on in this conversation with her are Vessels of Love, Poems and Prayers for the Later Years of Life, and Praying Our Goodbyes, a spiritual companion through life's losses and sorrows. And I know that you've had a chance to read and in some cases review these books, Jim.
Yeah, and also, her books are books that are often given out on retreats. And I don't think I've been at any retreat where my director hasn't said, oh, look at this page from Joyce Rupp. So I feel like she's kind of accompanied me on retreats ever since I entered the Jesuits. And I love her style. I love her openness and her just whole approach to the spiritual life. So
would you say that you met Joyce first through her writing and then later in person?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, when I was a novice, I was reading Joyce Rupp, and I didn't meet her till late in life, which is one of the things we're talking about today.
Yeah, we are talking about spirituality of aging. And I'm wondering how, in anticipation of this conversation, how you have been reflecting on aging and spirituality in your own life.
Well, quite a bit recently. I turned 64, which my nephews call the Beatles age, right? Will you still love me when I'm 64? And I think as, our bodies change and, diminish and even deteriorate, that means more doctor visits. My mother is getting older at 93. She's just been diagnosed this week with dementia. So, lots of questions about how you are in the world and how you can continue to be, hopeful and cheerful and loving as we age. And it's something that Joyce Rupp does very well in our interview, to talk about, what does it mean to age for all of us? What can young people learn about life from people who are older? And, how does your understanding of God even change? It's quite a great conversation.
And what I love about this conversation is, one, it's not just for older adults. It really is for anyone who is alive and aging. But then also, it's not a Debbie Downer conversation. Like, it is so hope inspiring and nourishing and encouraging, which is not always the kind of conversation that we hear around this topic.
Right, because aging is often framed as only diminishment and letting go, which is important, but there are a lot of freedoms and benefits that come with aging as well.
Okay, before we get to that exciting conversation, let's hear a question from one of our audience members. This question comes from Julie, and she asks, how do we revitalize a dry prayer life that feels like just going through the motions?
Great question, and one that I am asked constantly and also have to deal with as a prayer, someone who prays. I think the first thing to look at is, what does it mean, and maybe some of our listeners might not know this, what does it mean to have a dry prayer life? It basically means you close your eyes, or you're walking around, or you're kneeling, and you don't feel like anything is happening. I mean, I think something's always happening when you're with God in prayer. There's some deep conversion going on, but it doesn't feel like, or you can't notice any fruits, and that's difficult for people. It can go on for weeks, months, sometimes years. Mother Teresa famously, had it go on for years, decades. So I think it's important to say that it's natural, happens to everybody.
What would the opposite of a dry prayer life look like?
Well, you could say a rich prayer life would be one where you have lots of insights and emotions and desires and feelings, and you read the Gospels and you feel connected, and you might even have words and phrases that come up, and so it's very rich and exciting and full of images, and whereas the dryness, really, you don't feel like much is happening. You're bored, and it's kind of empty. And, one of the things to remember is that it's natural. Another thing to remember is it's good to look at your daily life, right, where God is present in your daily life, not just in your personal prayer. And then finally, I talk to people about mixing it up a little bit. If you're only doing the Psalms, for example, which is fine, I do the Psalms, maybe try some centering prayer. If you're only doing Ignatian contemplation, maybe try some nature prayer. So mixing it up, I think, really helps a lot. But it's a great conversation we have with Joyce. She has some great suggestions as well.
Yeah. And I know sometimes when people are encouraging me to, let's say, pray through journaling, like they're writing my prayers. Initially, I feel like that there is not much going on or not much to say. But the minute that the pen hits the page, or even if I'm doing it on the notes app on my phone, all of this material spills out, just even journaling. And sometimes I think prayer can function a little bit that way, that showing up for the discipline of it. And as you say, mixing it up, mixing that discipline up through different mediums, be it writing or centering prayer, or, so I like to pray when I'm walking, that that can really make a difference in opening your prayer life.
Yeah, one of the great things about journaling is that it forces you to notice, where has God been? I met one of Mother Teresa's spiritual directors. She had many. And, famously, she suffered from dryness. And she was talking to this spiritual director, a bishop. And she said, I just don't feel God at all. And at that moment, they were in Calcutta. A young kid came up and threw his arms around her and said, "Oh, Mother Teresa, I love you." And the bishop said, "Well, I hope you're noticing this stuff too," right? Yeah. Meaning encouraging her to notice also the stuff on the outside. And actually, he told me this story, and I said, "Well, you're telling a saint, you're giving her advice." And he said, "Well, we all need advice, right?" So part of it's also talking with someone about your spiritual life as well.
And something that you're so good at, Jim, is kind of breaking down the wall between prayer life and the rest of your life, and saying that, you want to engage your whole life fully in prayer, and to turn to it for signs of God's presence.
It's essential. Yeah. Well, thanks, Julie, for your question. It's a great question and a very common one. I also encourage you to stick around for what Joyce Rupp has to say, which is very deep, and it's really great. She has a lot of great perspectives on just that very topic.
And as a reminder, if you would like to ask Father Jim a question, you can always write to us at thespirituallife@americamedia.org.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Looking for a simple way to deepen your own spiritual life? Give Us This Day is a great resource that helps Catholics stay rooted in both Scripture and prayer, wherever you are, no matter how busy you are. It features both reliable and relatable spiritual reflections, essays on the lives of the saints, and of course, lots of prayers to accompany you through the day. I'm really honored to be an editorial advisor. I've been that since the very beginning, and I write a monthly essay called Teach Us to Pray. And also, I use Give Us This Day every day, so I'm not just a contributor, but a user. And here's a great offer right now. Listeners of The Spiritual Life can get 10% off their new print subscription. Just visit giveusthisday.org/spirituallife and join the community of Catholics praying together. Again, that's giveusthisday.org/spirituallife.
All right, now on to our conversation with Joyce Rupp.
Well, Sister Joyce Rupp, welcome to The Spiritual Life.
Hello, Jim, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here today.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I'm sure I've told you this many times, but I have used your books and your insights and your wisdom on so many retreats, and I can't count the number of spiritual directors who would say during one of our retreat sessions, "Here's a little page from one of Joyce Rupp's books." So
I'm just around to haunt you, Jim.
Yeah, that's right. I especially liked Fragments of Your Ancient Name, where you look at different ways of looking at God, which I just found so helpful. But your latest book, Vessels of Love, Poems and Prayers for the Later Years of Life, really does focus, later in life, on aging. So I kind of wanted to spend a little time talking about that today. Joyce, how would you describe a spirituality of aging? What does that mean for you?
Yeah. Well, when I think about a spirituality of aging, I think, first of all, I kind of have to define spirituality because I think it means a lot of different things to different people. And for me, it really means how the external part of my life influences the inner life and how the inner life influences the outer life. So when I think about a spirituality of aging, I actually, since Vessels of Love came out, I have another companion book on aging that's coming out this fall. And so I want to talk about the two metaphors and the two titles, because that really, to me, is the best way to explain what I think spirituality of aging is. So when I wrote Vessels of Love with the prayers and poems in it, there were lots of different topics, on those last years of life. And last years of life, I really think of as the 80s and 90s. There's a lot been written on the 60s and 70s. So in the 80s and 90s, I envision there's a real slowing down that happens, and what happens within us is that we have always had this great love of the divine within us and pouring into us and moving out of us. But life is so hurried when we are younger and when we're active and we're pre-retired. And even in retirement, people can be so busy in the 60s, 70s. But when you get to be 80 and beyond, you cannot keep up that pace no matter what. Your body won't allow you to do it. And so it's a great time to step back and to begin looking at what is my inner life all about. I had someone the other day, an older person, I think about 85, and he said to me, I've always been too busy to think about what's going on inside of myself. And I just believe that, at this point, our bodies help us to go to get to that inner space. And we are filled with love. And so as things begin being taken from us, our successes and our active life, we can allow more space in us to be that transparent vessel, to really have that love showing. And the other metaphor I have is ripening. I call that second book of essays The Years of Ripening, because my sense is that when we're born, we're filled with these beautiful qualities, altruistic characteristics and virtues. I mean, the potential for all of that is there in us. And then, we start growing, we develop our ego, and suddenly we're, aim for success, and what do other people think of us? What do we think of ourselves? And so a lot of those virtues sit there. Some of them are developed and some are partially developed. And then we get to old age. And what happens, at least it's happened for me, is that I have a lot more time to reflect on where am I with coming home to those qualities in me. And so I could say a lot more about that, but I don't want to go on and on, Jim. But I just think that it's a time to ripen and harvest the goodness that's in us. Some people would say it's coming home to your true self. I think it's the same kind of thing. It's just a very different metaphor for me.
Let me ask a few follow-up questions. That's wonderful. I love those two images. I would imagine some listeners might be thinking, well, how do I know what's going on in my inner life? And how do I know that that's God versus just my own ego? What do you say to people who have a hard time sort of identifying God within them or even experiencing God within them? Where would a person start?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. I think two things. One is we have to learn to trust our inner voice and discern, what is coming from our ego, what's coming from ourself. The other part, it's always been so important for me, and that's to have a companion, a spiritual guide, so I can sit down with this person and say, here's what's coming for me. How does that sound? And have some feedback on that. My last retreat this past summer, I had it all figured out what was going to happen. And I had chosen a place where I thought there was a lake and there wasn't. But anyway, the last thing my director said to me was, meet God where God wants to be met. And when I got to this place I'd never been before, instead of a lake, there was an oat field in front of me. And I thought, this oat field's got to be where God wants to meet me. And I tell you, it was one of the best retreats I ever had. I learned so much about myself through watching that oat field ripen. But it was my spiritual director, my spiritual guide that really helped me to get to that point. So I would say to people, begin listening. Some people, have a hard time even listening to what's within themselves. So write it down and then take it to someone you trust, someone who's been there before you, and begin processing that. Does that make sense?
It does. That's a great way of saying it too. Trusting what's going on inside of you. But I love that idea of taking it to someone who's been there before you, which is what a spiritual director is. It's so helpful. I think that I sometimes say, I don't know how people can live without a spiritual director. I mean, I know, that sounds very precious, but you do need someone to kind of accompany you. My second question is, and I've been dying to ask you this because I've read so many of your books. What if you're a person who just feels kind of resentment and anger and disappointment with what has happened in your life, and now you're aging and you feel like things are being taken away? You talked about the center being a part of love, but what happens? How do you counsel or have directees who are struggling with that as well? Kind of the resentment of age.
Yeah, yeah. I actually I actually haven't, companioned anyone who's felt that way, an older person, but I've been with older people. In
Hmm.
fact, I was just last week with someone who is really fighting, not wanting to leave her own home and all of that, anger that comes with it. Um I think it's really very difficult, but I think the first thing is to really listen to the person and let them just talk it all out and let them be as angry and as bitter as they want to be. And then try to, I would ask, what's happened in your past when you've been in a situation that was really tough for you or that you didn't want in your life? And how did you go about working through that? Because I think that has a lot to do with when we get older, how we have processed in the past. And so um, that's where I would begin. And I think it would be quite a journey to take with a person who's quite bitter. Some people never get over that bitterness. They just want to hang on to it. And so I think it would be just being very compassionate with that person and not trying to change them, but trying to help them to change themselves, and how that would happen.
I love that answer because you're actually directing the person to their own strengths or the wisdom that is available to
Mhm.
them with their age, saying, look back on your life and take note of the places where you have overcome a great obstacle or challenge. And then they might be able to find that within themselves at this other stage. One of the expressions that a lot of young people use today to mark time or different chapters of their life is eras, like
Mhm.
I'm in my whatever era.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, Jim and Joyce, was there a moment or a story you might be able to recall for us when you thought, I'm actually in a different era, that you kind
Mhm.
of noticed your age um, in in any sort of way, and it occurred to you that there was some spiritual development happening in this new chapter or era.
Yeah. Yeah. The two eras, I think that in my inner one was when I was in my midlife time, actually. And I stopped being able to use the prayer form I'd used for years, which was more of an Ignatian method of taking the scriptures and meditating and visualizing and putting myself in them. And it just kept getting in my way. And I was being called into my era was moving into contemplative prayer. And that I really finally said yes to that about age 60. And that's really been mine ever since. But I had a really hard time letting go of the security of the way I used to pray. And I think that for many people, that is a real turning. Externally, I moved into saying, yes, yes, I'm an older person. I'm an old person. It was right before COVID, and I thought, I have traveled so much for so many years, packing and unpacking my suitcase. I am so sick of being in airports and missing my flights and getting to someplace I'm supposed to talk, getting there late, that I don't want to do this anymore. I can't do this anymore. It's taking too much of my energy. It's taking my joy away from me. And that was a big move to say, I'm going to move into writing and spiritual guidance. And I'm letting go of traveling to speak before groups and all of that. And it was just a real acknowledgement, that it's time for me to say, I'm not in active ministry anymore. I'm much more in a reflective ministry. So, yeah.
And you can still come on podcasts, which is nice.
And you don't have to travel for
I
it.
don't have to do that
Who
in an
needs to
airport,
travel?
Jim.
It's much better than an airport. It's funny, Maggie. I had a similar experience, both spiritually and I would say, maybe physically. I also had expectations for myself on retreats and around those same challenges, right? Praying in an Ignatian way. And I realized that basically I do that best or maybe most fruitfully on retreat. And when I come home, I just can't do it. I just
Oh,
cannot do it. I pray for a half an hour or an hour in the morning, and there's just so much on my mind that I find it difficult to, as Ignatius says, compose the place and imagine yourself there. Some people can. And I said to my spiritual director once, I said, I really feel guilty. He said, why? I said, well, because all I'm doing is resting in God's presence. And he said, oh, that's not so bad. So I've kind of let go of that need,
yeah.
exactly, that need to, sort of control my prayer. Maggie, I can tell you exactly when I felt old. I had a direct T. So I'm 64. I had a direct T who was a young man, and he was thinking about entering the Jesuits. And he said, so he was about 25, and I guess this may have been about 10, 15 years ago. And I sort of considered myself more or less a peer. He's an adult, right? This is an adult man. And I'm an adult. And he said, well, I'm going down to my father's birthday party this weekend. I said, that's nice. How old's your dad? He said, it's a big birthday. He's 50. And I was 50. And I realized for the first time in my life, I not only could I conceivably be this guy's father, I am his father's age. I'm older than his father.
Yeah.
And I was telling my spiritual director, actually, Sister Maddie Tiberi up at Eastern Point, this story. And I said, I felt like I had to kind of go out of the room
Like compose
and
yourself.
the process. But, I was with this guy. I couldn't say this is, a difficult moment for
Yeah.
me. And, so I talked about it with her and she laughed and she said, well, wait till you're their grandparents' age, So I realized, look, I am just not this guy's age. He's
Yeah.
25 and I'm 50 and that's that. Right. And
Mhm.
also,
Mhm.
he and people in his age cohort and other younger Jesuits started looking to me as a older person, right? Like, oh, Jim,
Mhm.
what was it like when you entered 25 years ago? So it's kind of inevitable, but that was the moment I realized, oh my gosh, I'm old. And, but the other thing, I don't know how you feel about this, Joyce, but I know some people struggle with it. It didn't really bother me. I just thought, well, I'm at least I'm alive and I'm still working. And
Yeah.
because I
Yeah.
think one of the things we tend to overlook, and I wanted to, ask you this, we tend to sometimes focus on the challenges of aging, right? Our diminished bodies and all that. What have you enjoyed about it? What are the
Yeah.
delights of
Yeah.
aging?
Yeah. Yeah. I want to go back just a minute to what you
Yeah,
said
please.
about, because I think acceptance is such a big part of aging. And it's really the serenity prayer, accepting what I cannot change, courage to change the things I can. And ageism, because the way our society looks upon older people, it's like we're just kind of this commodity, either warehouse something or other. And what do we do with all these old people we're going to have in our country now? And honestly, for myself, I basically like being an older person. I do, and I accept that. But what is really hard for me is how society looks at me, and not just being invisible, but I heard someone in her late 80s last year said, and she was a highly successful artist, and she said, out of the clear blue, we weren't talking about age. She said, one of the hardest things for me is being treated as worthless. And I thought, wow, and I think some people do feel that way. It's sort of like we older people just sort of don't exist. But then I go back and I think about when I was in my 20s, 30s, 40s. How did I act when I was at family reunions? How about the great aunts that were sitting in the corner, sitting on the sidelines? I think it's something that I hope we can develop, a more of a sense of worth for our older members in our communities. Jim, I forgot what the question. Oh, you asked me
Yeah.
about the positive
The
things.
positives, yeah.
Yeah, positive things. Oh, one of the things I love about being older is that I do not pay much attention to what other people think about me. I mean, I know how society views me, but I am my own person, and it's very different than in the past. I'm not worried about how I look physically, not concerned about what I might say. I keep saying my new theme song is the last line from Gone with the Wind. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. and, but there's a great freedom in that, and there's a huge freedom for me because I've been so doing oriented all my life. I am creative. I had a lot of physical energy. I still have quite a bit. But to move away from the doing to the being part, just this morning I was sitting there and I have a lot longer time for my prayer and reading now in the morning. And I just love just sitting there. I was just watching the sunrise and I thought, I'm not worried about a deadline right now. And I do have deadlines, but I wasn't worried about then. But it's a whole different attitude or a different way of living. And it more emphasis on being, BE-ing than doing.
My novice director used to say when we were too busy, "You're human beings, not human doings."
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I'll never forget that.
yeah.
It sounds like, yeah, you sound really content with it. Were you a person that was very sort of active and concerned about appearance and what other people thought? I mean, in the past, had you been like that?
Oh, when I started out, one of the first jobs I had where I had to speak in front of people, I spent half my time before the talk being in the bathroom with diarrhea. I was so nervous and anxious about what people would think. And it took me quite a while, but where my change came for me was in my mid-30s. And that one verse in Ephesians 3:21, glory be to God whose power working through us can do more than we can ask or imagine. And it was at that point, you always hear this thing about turning your life over to God, but I really believe in that time. I just I just began really trusting that however I was to be, whatever I spoke, what I wrote for the most part would be okay. Yeah. Uh, and so I gradually got out of that thing of, I have to please other people. I will always have some concern about that, I think, as a human being, but not the major focus it was in the beginning. Like, I've got to prove myself and I have to be really busy all the time. And, I really had burnout when I was about 42. And it taught me a lot about having to take care of myself and not act the way I was trying to get everything done for everybody.
Yeah, that's been the great freedom for me too. I call it the freedom from the need to be liked, loved, or approved of.
Okay,
And
yeah.
I spent most of my early years, early years up to my 40s and 50s, you know, consciously trying to get people to like me. And it's very freeing because you ultimately realize you can't force people to like you. Some people aren't going to like you at all, no matter what you do. Some people didn't like Jesus, and he was pretty
Mhm.
nice. And most people, I had a therapist once say to me, I was frustrated about something, and how will this come across? And she said, which I loved, she said, actually, most people aren't thinking about you.
Mm.
That's
They're,
good.
th-
What
they're
a rude
yeah,
awakening.
yeah, they're thinking about themselves.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you might even when you're giving a talk, or
Mhm.
in my case, if you're saying mass or preaching or whatever, or you're whatever, uh, they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about, or particularly like in a social gathering, they're thinking about how they're coming off and what's going on in their minds. And so that's freeing too. That you're not you're not the star of their show, right? Now, have there been people in your life that have shown you what it means to age well and gracefully?
A lot of people, yes. You know, Jim, you interviewed me a few years ago about my mother when I wrote Fly While You Still Have Wings, but my mother's the first person I think of because she had such passion for life, but she was also so accepting of who she was and all the physical infirmities she had. The person I often go back to is my great aunt Ida. I always have loved her name. Her name was Ida Wilberding Delperdang. And I always thought
Wow.
that would be a great name for a novel in a novel, you know.
Yes.
But what she taught me was about accepting my physicality when I get older. That was one piece. She died at 88. She had these deep wrinkles. I mean, deep, deep wrinkles in her face. She had the most wonderful sense of humor. She never had a lot of money. Um, I knew her since I was very young, actually. She would take care of us sometimes. But as she got older, I loved to go visit her because it was just so enjoyable. And being in her presence was just enough for me. But I never heard her complain about being old. She always had a story to tell that was uplifting. So it would be my great aunt Ida, and the other one is Sister Evangelista in my community. She was a marvel. I remember she was like getting close to 100, and she had people going to the library and getting books for her because she was studying the Gospel of Luke, and
Great.
and she just was. Oh, she was a fine lady. I really, really learned a lot from her. So people like that, they're just real mentors, and they say to me, yes, I can be like that.
That's right. And, I've had that experience in the Jesuits over and over again, that you look to these in the Jesuits, older men, and you think, boy, I want to be just like him, right? I want to
Yeah,
be
yeah,
open and
mhm,
friendly and eager and
yeah,
cheerful
yep,
and not complaining. I've often thought, I don't know if this is your experience, the ones in the Jesuits who seem to age the most gracefully and the most cheerfully and are the most open are the ones who work in spirituality, are the ones who are spiritual directors or writing about spirituality or accompanying people. And I sometimes find that, and this is not always the case, the Jesuits who are so sort of tied to their work or their position, right? This is kind of who they are. Once they step out of those positions, if one spiritual director said to me, if you are what you do and then you're not active, you think of yourself as nothing.
yeah, who are
Whereas
you?
a lot of these spiritual directors were just so free and funny and relaxed and wise. And I thought, this is the way to be, right? And I think it's a choice too. The other one I love is I didn't know him very well, but Daniel Berrigan,
Oh,
the Jesuit activist.
mhm,
I remember I read something once where someone asked him, a journalist, you don't talk about your physical problems or your sicknesses or things like that. And he said, I'll never forget this. I was thinking about this morning. He said, I don't talk about that. That's a crashing bore.
what does that mean?
Which is kind of true because I think,
Yeah, yeah,
I even sit around the dinner table with, my brothers, even at my age. And, it's about this doctor and that doctor and, what my
mm,
cardiologist said and my, you know, whatever, this doctor. And, and I think part of it is really sort of putting all that in perspective. We all have bodies, as one of my directors would say,
yeah,
but
mm,
it's not kind of central. But so I found in my life it's the spirituality gurus, if you will,
mhm.
who seem to be the most at peace, and I guess it makes sense, because they're spending time with the spirit in themselves and in other people.
Jim, when you were talking about the older Jesuits and that in my community, I have found that something happens with people who've suffered a lot, and they come to a point where they turn outward, and when people come in the room, their focus is on that person and not on themselves, and they'll ask how they are or how their children are, or just I mean, they're and our oldest I last week I visited our oldest member is 97, and everybody loves to visit her because you'll come in and you feel like, you know, you're the person she's been waiting for, that just you're such a gift to her and so on. There's no attention to herself. And, she was sitting there, she had a fall, had broken her back, her arm was in a sling. And there was nothing about, woe is me. And, she never even talked about her physical condition. It was just such a special visit, really.
That's a huge gift.
Mm-hmm.
And not everybody has that gift,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Right.
And I sometimes wonder if it's also regional too,
Wow.
right? I think in New York, people are much more likely to kind of dwell on the negative. That's not
Okay.
universal, but
Yeah.
Maggie, you had a question, I think, about yeah.
I am noticing that there is just such a tremendous rise of cosmetic procedures of like Botox and injectables and all of these things that my peers and mostly women, in their sometimes late 20s and 30s and 40s and stuff
Mhm.
are doing. And it feels to me like while those things almost used to be reserved for um, older women maybe trying to preserve a youthful appearance, that like it's getting increasingly younger, um, such that we don't even have permission to age. um, and the prevalence of it is really starting to get to me because I know so many people who are turning to it. So, Joyce, if you were to speak to someone like myself, or maybe somebody listening who feels constantly inundated with messaging around their appearance and how aging might be affecting that, what would you want to say?
Hmm. It would depend on what you were saying to me. If you were talking to me about the pressures of having to, you know, have a certain look because of
Mm.
society, I would address that public. But if you didn't, if you were just talking with me, but I knew that you were, you know, really focused a lot on that, I think what I wouldn't talk about that with the person. What I would do is I would get them or encourage them to talk about what they really value in their life.
Mm.
And I would want to lead them towards self-worth and, um, and then, eventually could circle around to, how much, externally, how much that is of value and so on. But, um, I think our culture's always been obsessed with physical looks. Last night on the news, I mean, I just was just shaking my head. There was a whole thing on, and I don't know what program it is, but some woman's on it and she has like irregular teeth or a gap in her teeth. And now everybody's talking about, oh, it's okay for her not have perfect teeth, And I mean, it's just so much a part of our society. So I think the only way around that, I think we're not going to change the culture's view on that. But I do think that much more emphasis on who and what is really of value, for yourself. What's lasting in your life, you know?
Mhm. In other words, like, don't try to go to war with the cosmetic
No.
industry. Don't
No.
confront that head on, but just shift the focus of the
Yeah.
conversation to what
Yeah.
is truly of value and most nourishing.
I think that's where the energy's valuable there rather than wasting the energy on something much larger than any of us can control. Yeah.
I also think it applies, different ways to men and young men as well. So much of this is we don't want to make it the kind of bête noire of everything, but I think social
Mhm.
media really contributes to that
Yeah.
because when people share their photos, they filter them and they pick the ones where they look the best and the most attractive, and people tend to compare themselves, what they know is their sort of a friend of mine said mixed bag life, to their perceived perfection that they see in other people's lives. And I think
Yeah.
that really does damage to a lot of people, this compare and
Right.
despair,
Right.
because you start to, as Joyce was saying, you're sort of drawn away from what you have in life.
Mhm.
Another friend of mine says, "Can you have what you have?" Right?
Ooh,
Can
I
Mm.
you
love that.
really? Yeah, I
Yeah.
I love it
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. That's
Joyce, as
beautiful.
we're before we come to the end, I really did want to focus a little bit on one of my favorite books of yours, which I'm sure everyone says the
Mm.
same thing, which is Praying Our
Mhm.
Goodbyes, and
Yeah.
talk a little bit about loss and grief and even death.
Yeah.
Where did Praying Our Goodbyes come from? And maybe you can talk a little bit about what that book it does and where it came from.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, thank you for that. I really wrote that book out of for two reasons, I guess. One was my own healing process. My brother drowned when he was 23 and I was 25. And it took me about 15 years really to move through all of that. And it was the old stuff of well, my brother was so good. Why did God let him die? And it was an old view of God, but it was my view at that time. And the other was I so wanted to help other people get through their sorrows. The big thing I learned from writing Praying Our Goodbyes was that the deeper down we go, the more alike we are than different. And when I wrote that book, that was my second book that I had published, and I had sent it out to a number of people to see what they thought of it. And one of the people I sent it to was a director of clinical pastoral education out in Seattle. I didn't know him very well. But anyway, he wrote back to me and he said, I really like the book, but you need to talk more about your brother's death. Now, I was very guarded about my feelings at that time and how I responded. And so I just kind of stated the facts and how it took me a long time. And, I was really kind of irritated by his response. And I thought, well, who are you to tell me to bare my soul, kind of thing. But I thought, well, Joyce, you did ask him for his advice, his critique. So I really did expand on that. And I became very vulnerable with how I struggled with all of that. And do you know that to this day, most of the people that write to me about that book, almost all of them will say, the part I appreciated the most was what you wrote about your brother, because then they knew that what I wrote in that book was real. But really, it's taught me, Praying Our Goodbyes has taught me so much about being respectful of the time it takes for people to grieve, and knowing that there are so many layers and levels and different kinds of things that people grieve, things that I might not grieve that someone else really will, so people that lose a pet. Now, I've never had a close pet, but it's like a death in the family for some people when their dog dies. So Praying Our Goodbyes covers a lot of different kinds of farewells, and it really deals with a lot of the misperceptions we have about God's involvement in our sorrows. Yeah.
Well, I want to ask the follow-up question is kind of obvious. So you let go of that God, your brother's death. Why would God do this to a good person? So who is the new God? How is God different for you now?
Well, you know how the turning point for me was a Jesuit retreat.
Of course.
I made the 40-day Ignatian retreat, and praying the life of Jesus was such a turning point for me. And when I came to the end of that retreat, instead of asking why me, I asked why not me. I thought here, I looked at the life of Jesus, and and that life moved through to a new life form, and it just helped me really let go of what I was hanging on to. And it's just been different for me ever since. It really is a God who suffers with me rather than the God that brings suffering, which was the old form of knowing.
And Joyce, how has grief changed the way that you pray to God?
Oh, my whole understanding of this divine presence in old age is really one of just a great love. And so when people ask me to pray for them, I take it seriously, and I always write them down. I have a little note section in my journal, but I just name people to God. Now I say, you know what to do for them and with them. And so I just say their names in my prayer. And it doesn't do this for them or cure this cancer, but it's just naming them and having that compassionate connection to me is sufficient.
Okay, so one last question for the both of you before we go. This comes to us from Julie, and she writes in, how do we revitalize a dry prayer life that feels like going through the motions?
Well, I can start. I don't want to say that's an easy question, but it's a question I get all the time, so I'm used to answering it. Now, St. Ignatius sometimes says, if your prayer is dry, pray more, right? If you're dry for 15 minutes, pray for half an hour. I sometimes think that's almost like kind of unfair punishment for people. I usually suggest a couple things. The first thing I suggest is mixing it up, right? So, Joyce was talking before about how she was, constantly using Ignatian contemplation. If that's getting stale for you, try centering a prayer or try Lectio Divina or try spiritual reading, or try walking in nature, right? So I think mixing it up, I had a woman directee who would be praying the exact same way for 10 years, and it just became a burden. And she said, I get up, I do my rosary, then I review the prayer of the gospel of the day, and I do my Ignatian contemplation. Then I have a list of people to pray for, and then I do Lectio Divina. And it was like a burden. And I said, kind of get rid of that and just do something you enjoy, something simple. So mixing it up is good. The other thing is to look for God in your daily life. So if your prayer life, your interior life is dry, look around you, right? Look to see where God is in relationships and work and ministry and whatnot, in nature and art. And then sometimes that's where the examination of conscience, the review of the day, comes in. So you can review where God has been in the active life, and that usually what happens is that kind of calms the person down, and the person says, oh, okay, I can see God. And then the person isn't so focused, in a sense, on the interior prayer. So those are the things I generally recommend for dryness. And it's also to say one more thing, it's totally natural. You're not doing something wrong, and you're not bad, and God doesn't, hate you or has withdrawn God's grace from you. And that's helpful in my own life, because we all have dry periods. So to say it's natural is part of the ups and downs of any relationship. What would you say, Joyce?
Well, thank you for what you've shared, and the last thing would be the first thing that I would say. And it depends on how long that space is, that dry prayer is. Depends on what else is happening. I mean, if they're in clinical depression, their prayers, it's going to be tough. But I really like what you just said. It's natural. I call it the ebb and flow. I say it's like the ocean, it's just going to come, it's going to go. Adding to what you've shared, I often talk with them or suggest to them spiritual reading. And by that, I mean inspirational reading. To me, it nourishes or it feeds the spirit. And it can be a great help to someone. And then what you had said, Jim, I often ask them to focus on how they find kindness around them, or how they find a sense of the presence of God. What are some good qualities that you find in people, and just being aware of that starts reconnecting them again to a relationship. And the other thing that I bring up with someone when they're talking about how dry their prayer is what do they believe the response of prayer ought to be? I mean, prayer is not about good feelings. Prayer is about relationship. And for some people, if they're not euphoric all the time, there is something wrong. It's like that prayer is really, it's pretty, calm there. We don't often get those great, fabulous moments that we read about with the saints.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, Joyce, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciated your words today. And thanks so much for your beautiful books and your ministry of accompaniment.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. I've learned so much in listening to you.
Blessings for both of you as you continue on your journey.
She's wonderful.
She really was.
Isn't she?
And was so vulnerable with us.
Yeah, talking about her, her brother's death, also the diarrhea she had before she goes on to talk. She's one of my favorite spiritual authors. And, there's also just a kind of presence she has that I think calms you down. I think she's one of the rare spiritual writers who's just as good in person, right? Mm-hmm. And just as good kind of, when you're listening to her, sometimes it doesn't translate,
mm-hmm.
very well. You might be a great writer, but you may not be very compelling in person.
Right.
But she's fantastic. Now, had you known much about her beforehand, or?
No, you actually introduced me to Joyce Rupp's writing. So thank you for that. And now I feel privileged. I didn't have to go on 40 Jesuit retreats in order to meet Joyce Rupp.
I also think, one of the things I was going to ask her was the kind of aging that she's doing and the people that she pointed to, which were really inspiring. I wonder how common that is, because when I run into older people like that, it's kind of a surprise. And I wish that, more older people were like that, basically. And it gives me something to shoot for, right? Because,
yeah.
I think we all see people who are old and maybe bitter and think, gosh, I do not want to be like that. I don't want to be complaining all the time. I don't want to be a burden. This is one of my pet peeves. I don't want to always be talking about my medical problems and all that. And so it was kind of inspiring in that way too, making me want to be a better older person and just a better person. Because I think it's not just about aging. This is appropriate for someone in their 20s, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think she is an example of somebody who has clearly been well loved and cared for and is able to speak from this place of great love and compassion. And I know that because even within myself, I don't have that much to be cranky about. And yet I still like kvetch all the time about my silly small woes. But I do know that when I have been well loved and cared for, when I have been listened to, as she recommends doing, if someone's kind of cantankerous, to just let them vent for a minute. And when that happens, it's like I come back to myself, and there's a spaciousness within me that wasn't there before.
Well, and something you said really struck me, and it reminded me of something that I find really important, which is she's not only someone who's well cared for, she's also someone who avails herself of retreats and spiritual direction.
Yes.
And my experience in Jesuit life and just in life in general is that, people who are open to receiving direction, going on retreats, going to therapy, listening to a spiritual counselor, being challenged, in a word, are the ones who are able to grow the most, right? And I think that is just so key, because I know a lot of people, even my age and older, who have just stopped, right? I mean, they're not interested in seeing a therapist. They're not interested in going on a retreat. And if they go on a retreat, they don't want a director, because it's challenging. And so what I'm trying to say is that she's someone who's open to being challenged and molded and still formed. And I think that's so important for all of us, no matter if we're 20 or 80. Are you open to that? Because here's the point. It's hard.
Yeah.
As you probably know, it's hard to have someone challenge you or invite you to grow. But I think it's so essential. And the people I know who are the most free are the ones that are the most open to being challenged and changed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't graduate from the spiritual life at any point, right? So we always need teachers and mentors and directors and people who are going to challenge us. And it's funny, I think you could look at going on a retreat as a challenge. In my experience, it is that, but you emerge feeling so cared for because someone has taken an interest in your inner life.
Yeah.
So it is both a challenge, but it's also a comfort.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because, sometimes people will say, "Oh, how was your retreat?" And I'll say, "It was kind of hard." And they say, "What?" It's like, yeah, it's hard. If you really kind of are open to it, right? I mean, this whole idea of wrestling with God, it's in the Bible. It's kind of tough. I wanted to talk a little bit about 3 of Joyce's books.
Yes.
2 of them we focused on, and one of them I just want to recommend. We focused on Vessels of Love, which is really fascinating. The subtitle is Poems and Prayers for the Later Years of Life. Very contemplative, and there's a lot of poetry, right? And she's a poet as well, so sort of a collection. Praying Our Goodbyes, I think I looked it up. It sold like 250,000 copies already. I think that's the one she's the most known for. And it's about loss, grieving, death. As she said, she talks about her brother's untimely death. That's a beautiful book. And, who of us isn't going through transitions? But the one that I really have loved is called Fragments of Your Ancient Name. It's a small book. And she looks at various, I think it's 99, images of God. God as the woman who is, peeling potatoes or, peeling peas on her lap. And I think, we talked a little bit earlier about being stuck or feeling dry. Something like that book can really help you in your dryness. Just sort of, and Joyce talked about doing spiritual reading, which I think is really important when you're struggling with dryness. So these are great books. And also, in my own book, Learning to Pray, I talk a lot about dryness, and also spiritual direction, which we talked a lot about, just what it is and how you do it. So a couple books in case you want to go a little deeper.
And you can find Joyce's books on her website, which is joycerupp.com. And of course, Jim's many books wherever good books are sold.
Thanks, Maggie.